You guys can clap. And then one for the
other side.
Katrina.
Okay, yes. Oh. Thanks, sir. Thank you.
Okay, welcome everybody. So I have the pleasure of announcing our grand round speaker for today. So Dr. Chelsea Younghans was born and raised in rural Wisconsin, where there was a lack of stoplights, but no lack of cows. She completed her undergraduate degree at Valparaiso University with a BS in psychology and minors in chemistry, biology, and the humanities. She went on to attend the Medical College of Wisconsin with an HPSP scholarship and was involved in community veteran health and military medicine within the institution. Her psychiatric interests include veteran and veteran family mental health, as well as child and adolescent psychiatry and perinatal psychiatry. She currently acts as the chief of the psychiatry residency, in case you guys didn't know, and will be hanging around another 2 years to complete a fellowship in child and adolescent psychiatry here at NCC. In her free time, she enjoys cooking, hiking, and traveling with her husband and her 1-year-old daughter. So if we could give Dr. Younghans a big round of applause for the grand rounds today.
Good morning. Thank you, Katrina. I appreciate that. So we had such a lovely opportunity to hear from her last week on music and music therapy. And so I thought, why not do a complete 180 and talk about active shooter drills in schools and school-age children. I have nothing to report. All these ideas are my own. So for our objectives today, so we're going to define what an active shooter drill is. There's a lot of controversy on what that looks like and a lot of working definition. So we'll take a look at that. And then we're going to see what are the psychological implications of these drills, particularly on school-age children. We're going to demonstrate possible interventions to minimize gun violence. And truly, if necessary, that these drills happen, we're going to take a look at how do you reduce iatrogenic effects from these drills. And then lastly, we're going to discuss how psychiatrists can be involved in reducing gun violence within your own communities. So when Katrina and I were comparing presentations, we both had this, independent of each other, had this slide. And so I think for a lot of us, it made sense how Katrina ended up with music therapy, right? She's always singing. We love her for her passion about music. But Chelsea, why on God's greenest of earths did you decide to talk about active shooter drills? I married into a family voluntarily of educators. So my father-in-law is a principal. He's been in school administration for over 20 years. My mother-in-law was an elementary school teacher, transitioned to kind of the head teacher of a school, and now actually in her retirement works full-time at an alternative school program for young men who are in and out of the juvenile detention centers. I have a sister-in-law who's a high school English teacher, another sister-in-law who's a preschool teacher, and then I married this guy who is a high school history teacher. He teaches at a private Islamic school in Northern Virginia. He teaches history. So not only do I have some skin in the game in terms of the education system, but I am the proud aunt of now 6. So there's a 1 in addition to when this picture was taken. 6 beautiful nieces and nephews. I am the very, very, very proud mother of my 1-year-old, although I refer to her as my petri dish. Literally, my life revolves around her. And I'm hoping to be a child psychologist, a psychiatrist. So I have an exorbitant amount of skin in the game in terms of the effect of active shooter drills and essentially gun violence in our schools and in our communities. And a lot of other people have skin in the game too. Every year, every day, we're inundated by these headlines of another mass shooting, another child who brought a gun to school, another child, teacher, coworker, family member who's died by gun violence. And so this is something that people are truly starting to speak up about, take up the torch. And I want to provide some ideas and ways in which you can do that as well. So how big of a problem is this? So from 2013 to 2021, there are about 848 incidences of gunfire on school grounds. Of these incidents, there were 573 that occurred on the grounds of a preschool through high school. This resulted in almost 200 deaths and almost 400 people wounded. Nearly half of the victims in these incidences were students. And this represents a small portion of the nearly 3,500 children and teens that are shot and killed every year, and the 15,000 that are shot and wounded. In 2019, children comprised about 22% of our country's population in total, but they account for almost 25% of all victims in mass shootings. In the shooting incidences where we're able to take stock of the racial makeup of the student body, 2 and 3 incidences occurred in majority minority schools, showing us that the burden of gun violence has a particularly crucial impact on our Black students. Although Black students represent approximately 15% of the K through 12 school population in America, they make up about 30% of the average population at schools that have been affected by gun violence or a fatal shooting. I was impressed that they were able to get this data out for the end of 2022, considering that we're like in the second year of January. Yeah, so, but I think it's impressive, actually, the increase that we see from 2021 into the 2021-2022 school year. And this only accounts for the 9-10 months that the school is actually going year round. And so these are number of incidences of gunfire on school property. The other interesting thing, if I were to have brought up the graph from that ended at 2022-2021, they didn't have to include preschools. So over the last year, we've actually had to include preschools in data, so having gunfire on preschools. So I just got done telling you, I think, what are big, scary numbers, but statistically, what does this actually look like? What does this mean? So death from a school shooting is about 1 in 1 million annually. Dying in a motor vehicle accident is about 1 in 114. The CDC states victimization rates for single victim school-associated youth homicides is about 0.03 per 100,000. And when you compare it to a multi-victim school-associated homicide, it goes down to about 0.008 per 100,000. Only about 0.2% of gun deaths a year actually occur on school grounds. So via that number, you may think that there's less of an impact, right? These are kind of rare events that maybe get a lot of social media hype or kind of pull at people's heartstrings. So we know that although less than 1% of gun violence at schools in the US are actually mass shootings, 75% of our youth cite this as a primary source of their anxiety. So what are active shooter drills? So one prominent school safety strategy is these drills, active shooter drills. These drills typically require students and staff to remain on lockdown in a designated area and usually practice some sort of specific emergency procedure. Most of the time, these include locking doors, turning lights off, remaining quiet, but they can also feature tactics like fighting back, distracting the shooter, and evacuating. In some instances, the drills are unannounced and actually simulate an active shooter on the premises. There's 3 basic models when you break it down of active shooter drills. So the first is a lockdown drill, active shooter simulation, and an option-based approach. The most popular one is called run, hide, fight, so we'll particularly look at that one. Lockdown drills, you're probably most familiar with. There are relocation of students and staff away from possible harm. So this traditionally involves locking the door, moving students out of sight, and requiring them to turn off lights, remain quiet in the room. Active shooter simulations can sometimes incorporate the use of technology, so announcements made over the loudspeaker. Sometimes they involve props, fake guns, fake blood, and they usually involve some sort of actor, so law enforcement, student and staff volunteers, or trainers that are brought in. Active shooter simulations are intended to facilitate positive decision-making in a very high-stress environment. And lastly, we have options-based drills like the run, hide, fight model. And these attempt to improve kind of traditional lockdown procedures by encouraging staff to make informed decisions based on an evolving nature of some sort of emergency. These types of responses and training procedures have been adopted by schools, government agencies, and a lot of major corporations. This run, hide, fight model is actually endorsed by the Department of Homeland Security and instructs individuals to run if you can, hide if you must, fight if you have to. It was originally developed for workplace violence and has since been modified, kind of tailored to address active shooters in schools. Another example of an option-based program is called ALICE, Alert, Lockdown, Inform, Counter, and Evacuate. This was developed by a former law enforcement officer, Greg Crane, in 2014. Since the 1999 Columbine shooting, active shooter drills in schools have just exploded. 40 schools now require it by state law that public schools have some sort of active shooter drill. 95% of American schools already drill students on lockdown procedures, yet there's no research affirming the value of these drills for preventing school shootings or protecting the school community when a shooting does occur. Eager to demonstrate decisive, quick action, school districts have purchased products ranging from state-of-the-art surveillance technology, metal detectors, facial recognition software, and bulletproof whiteboards. With for-profit companies charging school districts thousands of dollars for trainings, the active shooter drill industry is part of a school safety cash flow of $2.7 billion, all in pursuit of a practice that to date is not evidence-based. So what's the problem? Why don't we have any evidence base for this? For all their good intentions, active shooter drills are not without controversy. Leading researchers and experts have raised questions about these drills' over-reliance on preparing for rare events, the feasibility of a child actually retaining this information, increased risk of harm associated with fighting back, risk of counterproductive information sharing, given that many mass school shooters are current students of that school or former students of that school, and the risk of inducing trauma. These challenges are further compounded by a lack of consistency in drills, with some schools providing advanced parental notification and developmentally appropriate exercises, and others employing mass gunman actors, simulated gunfire, and actually failing to inform participants when the drills were over. And so this is the problem. This is from the National Education Association that looked at different incidences that happened during active shooter drills. Having students that feel trapped, scared, and afraid, being locked in a locker room because you didn't know whether the drill was real or not, having students and staff pulled out into the hallway and shot in the back with pellet guns, and having teachers who were pretended to be shot in front of their students. That's the problem. Why is it hard to study? Why don't we have evidence that helps tailor drills? So despite their prevalence, little is known about the effectiveness of these drills in terms of keeping students safe. There are several reasons for this. The heterogeneity of drill procedures implemented, ethical considerations when you talk about children and potentially making them feel like they're in a life or death situation, and a lack of universal criteria makes evaluating active shooter drills very difficult. For example, one study by a researcher named Poland, it is not the country, in 2016 notes that the most important goal of an effective active shooter drill or crisis drill is to teach students to listen to the nearest adult and follow their instructions. This research said that active shooter simulations do a very poor job of achieving this goal. In contrast, a report issued by the National Association of School Psychologists and School Research Officers argues that the most important goal of an active shooter drill is to save lives by empowering and preparing students and staff to respond quickly and responsibly in the event of an active shooter. Current research on active shooter drills in schools is really mixed. Given the nature of active shooter incidences, it's nearly impossible to study the direct impacts of drills on safety during these horrific events. Instead, most researchers opt to observe compliance with emergency procedures during drills and learn from surveys of safety and anxiety following the drills. Some of these studies demonstrate significant improvement in students' ability to complete emergency procedures, like locking doors and turning lights off. And then some show that there's a lot of struggle, like maintaining staying out of sight and maintaining being quiet. Some find that participants report feeling less anxiety and a greater preparation immediately following drills, while others find diminished perceptions of school safety and concerns that could-be shooters now know exactly what the school's response is going to be. Perhaps more troublesome than the current lack of scientific consensus on active shooter drills is the lack of research on current long-term consequences and wider community impacts, like trauma and mental and physical health impairments. Given that active shooter incidences are rare, with student homicides happening every 1 in 6,000 years per a single school, potentially common and far-reaching impacts of drills are important to understand, especially as parents, students, educators, and medical professionals express growing concerns. So I just got done telling you that it's really hard to research this, so I'm going to show you some research articles now. So first, we're going to take a look at this study done by Everytown for Gun Safety and Georgia Tech. And it's, in terms of studies, I think it's really cool the way that they set this up. So Everytown for Gun Safety partnered with Georgia Tech to study changes in social media 90 days before an active shooter drill and 90 days after. They did this across the country, so in over 133 schools. This included a mix of elementary through high school, and they used natural language processing techniques and advanced statistical analysis to understand the changes in these conversations. They looked at almost 28 million tweets and over 1,400 Reddit posts related to school drills in these 114 schools. Moms and Students Demand Action for Gun Sense identified the dates of lockdown drills for all the schools K through 12 in 2018 and 2019, and then they compared them. So the way that they prepared the data or established the data, they took a look at 3 different subgroups: mental health, physical health, and community outcomes. So we're gonna hear some example of some of the tweets that they pulled. We're gonna take a look first at the mental health implications. So the results revealed that social media posts displayed a 42% increase in anxiety and stress from pre to post drills. The words that triggered that were afraid, struggling, and nervous. They also showed a 39% increase in depression, and the words that they kind of pulled from that were therapy, cope, irritability, and suicidal. This trend was sustained 90 days following drills and spanned diverse school districts, as well as many different types of drill tactics. Individuals expressed more social and personal concerns. So there was a 33% increase in concerns about friends, 14% increase in concerns about social situations, and then 108% increase in concerns about the workplace. There were fewer positive sentiments and more requests for help after drills. So this study further suggests that active shooter drills impact different age groups differently. However, each school level, so even though they looked at elementary through high school, each school level had its own challenges. So the highest level of stress and anxiety came in the high school population at a 52% increase, but their depression levels remained consistent. Middle and high school students, as well as parents and teachers, had an increase in both anxiety and stress, which was at 48%, and an increase in depression, which was at 55%. Elementary school communities experienced stress and anxiety increase at 28%, and their depression levels increased about 30%. So these differences, when you look at it kind of across the spectrum, reflect the reality that about 75% of our gunfire incidences happen on high school and college campuses. For high school communities, drills may induce stress and anxiety over the potential reality that an active shooter could happen. For middle school communities, it may induce a sense of hopelessness as to what their future educational experience is going to look like. And for elementary school communities, a lot of this hinged on parents and teachers, as consistent, meaningful interaction with social media is usually less in this population. But it shows that shootings and active shooter incidences happen less in the elementary school population. Regardless of education level, active shooter drills induce multiple mental health concerns with still developing children and teens. A pattern that stands to greatly impact our next generation's psychological health. So the next subgroup they talked about was physical health. So this study also suggested that physical health is significantly impacted by drills. In the 90 days following a drill, concerns about health itself increased 23%, and concerns about death increased 22%. Words that triggered this were blood, pain, clinics, and pills. Came up with drawing frequency, suggesting that drills may not only directly impact a person's physical health, but at least make it a topic of concern more frequently.
You said these words are triggered. Is this, you said this is just from social media posts?
Mm-hmm. In this way, active shooter drills in schools may be driving yet another troublesome shift in America's youth, whereby children and teens are confronted with their own mortality younger and more frequently than they ever have before. And lastly, a little glimmer of hope, hopefully, in this study when we look at community outcomes. Coupled with the previous physical and mental health impacts, active shooter drills in schools also spark a period of reflection, specifically on guns in schools and planning for the future. In the 90 days following drills, research suggests that online conversations featured significantly more words that show attempts to make sense of why something occurred, references to the past and what will happen in the future, and reflections of the experience itself and what feelings were evoked. This interpretation is derived from social media posts with more complex arguments that are rich with many details and more attributions, temporal references, and perceptions. It also included a considerable increase in cursing. Despite, or perhaps in response to, the harmful impacts, Everytown and Georgia Tech study suggests that active shooter drills may fuel collective action and community advocacy. This trend is evidenced through an increase in the focus on others' well-being, so about a 10% in the use of the term they, and actions taken together as a community, about a 48% increase in the use of the word we. This finding rings true with the growth and increasing involvement of moms and students demand action. And the trend whereby school shooting incidences and the fear that surrounds them propels many to join the broader movement of gun violence prevention. So the next study we're going to take a look at is specifically the perception that students have of fear and risk in their school. So historically, research on fear of crime in the school environment has looked at effects of physical and non-physical security measures, like metal detectors, security cameras, security guards, visitor login requirements, and it has compared that to the fear of crime and negative perceptions of safety. Using the data collected by the National Longitudinal Study of Adolescent Health, one study found that highly visible security measures like metal detectors and security cameras decrease student perception of safety at school. This research further noted that perceptions of safety in school are also affected by race, class size, prior victimization experience, and the neighborhood conditions in which the schools are located. So this study particularly found that security guards at predominantly white schools increase the perception of fear as opposed to in predominantly Black schools. It's possible that rehearsing crisis drills like active shooter drills has a negative effect on fear and the perception of safety at school. It reinforces the idea that an active shooter situation could occur. However, it's also possible that active shooter drills decrease fear in students and improve perceptions of school safety due to a sense of feeling more prepared. One researcher, Connell, in 2018 notes that research evidence suggesting differential effects in response to security procedures could be explained by a cohort effect, where our most recent cohort, our newest generation of students, has become so familiar with these security measures in their schools and in their public settings, doesn't bother them as much. Research has shown that increased fear of victimization at school can contribute to a variety of negative outcomes, like a lack of concentration, avoiding certain places within the school, or truly just avoiding school altogether. School avoidance as a consequence of fear can contribute to lower test scores, lower college attendance, failing classes, and reduced graduation odds. There's also a negative relationship between fear at school, time spent studying, and self-esteem. So the central finding to this study showed that students who experienced an active shooter drill in high school reported feeling increased levels of fear, increased perceptions of risk, and a decreased perception that they were actually safe within their school. And the last study that we're going to take a look at also has kind of a cool social media setup. So My Voice is an open-ended text poll service, specifically targeting youth ages 14 to 24, so that teen and young adult population. They sent out this survey to almost 1,300 participants and received about 815 responses, particularly looking at what drills are like for students in schools, their perception of the drills, and kind of their response to them, how it makes them feel. So the results of this study show that youth experiences with drills span a wide range. Some hide in silence under desks, and some experience simulated shooters banging on their classroom doors. Findings show that among a diverse sample of youth in the United States, gun violence at 82% and active shooter drills at 68% impact a large majority of our youth, many times in negative or unintentional ways. Shockingly, few youth in this study, only 6%, said that they experienced active shooter drills that follow the national guidelines of run, hide, fight. 6%. More than half of the youth in this study, at 60%, reported feeling unsafe, scared, helpless, or sad as a direct result from the drills. Respondents who practiced drills made it clear that these emotions reflect the very serious implications. One student said, active shooter drills make me feel afraid because if you make a noise, your life and the life of your friend could be in danger. Youth were also conflicted over the effectiveness of drills, with one describing them as a necessary evil. Although more than half, at 56%, stated that drills made students more prepared for an active shooter event, there was a lack of consensus over whether they actually make schools safer. So I'd like to practice some trauma-informed care as we move on to the second half of this. That's really heavy material. And so the next half is much brighter. It's more inspiring. It gives you a plan of what you can do. I think it's important to look at that data, and that's why I presented it. But I want to take into effect that it is really heavy to think about those statistics and gun violence and anything happening to children. So I want to start on the broadest plane possible. So we're going to start with what can happen on a federal level. Here are some recommendations for kind of countrywide and federal level gun safety. So federal law requires a background check from licensed gun dealers. It doesn't require a background check from unlicensed dealers. These are people that sell weapons on the internet or at gun shows. So this allows people who are prohibited from buying weapons, like those who have domestic violence restraining orders, felony convictions, other reasons why they may be barred. It allows them to still obtain weapons through this loophole. This loophole should be closed to require background checks on all gun sales, not just on the sale of firearms from licensed gun dealers. And there's a plan to do this. Well, proposed plan to do this. So the most common federal background check legislation would simply require the buyer to meet the seller at a licensed gun dealer. And the licensed gun dealer would run the background check just like they would as if the person bought the weapon directly from them. 99% of Americans live within 10 miles of a gun dealership. And there are 59 unique gun dealers across the country, 4 times as many McDonald's and twice as many post offices. Gun owners are already accustomed to this process because they do it every time they buy a weapon from a gun dealer. Next, we can take a look at extreme risk laws or red flag laws. They are simultaneous terms. Extreme risk laws allow a judge to temporarily remove a person's access to weapons when there's evidence that they pose a serious risk. The court provides due process protections that meet the standards set by the Supreme Court. Judges enter an emergency short-term order after law enforcement or a family member kind of makes a petition that the person poses an immediate risk to themselves or others. Another area of implication is federal safe storage laws. So one study found that if households locked both firearms and ammunition, were at 78% lower risk of self-inflicted firearm injuries and an 85% lower risk of unintentional firearm injuries by children and teens. This was compared to those who don't lock any of their weapons. Another estimated that if half of the households with children that have at least one unlocked gun switched to locking their weapons, they would reduce 1/3 of youth gun homicides and unintentional deaths. This would save an estimated 250 youth every year. 80% of shooters under the age of 18 got the weapon from their home or from a home of a friend or relative. 23 states, including DC, have already taken this step and already have a state secure storage law. And lastly, when we take a look at the age requirement for buying firearms, we should raise the minimum age to buy semi-automatic weapons to help block gun sales to teens. Data shows that 18 to 20-year-olds complete homicide at triple the rate than those over the age of 21. The shooter at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas at Parkland, Florida, was 19 years old. By federal law, he was too young to buy a handgun, but he could walk into a gun dealership and buy an assault rifle, an AR-15. Because in Florida, there's no restriction on firearms for those under the age of 21. Since then, Florida has actually changed its law, and you can't buy a weapon at all if you're under the age of 21. Moving now towards more community-based interventions. State legislatures and schools should create and fund threat assessment programs. These programs offer members of the school community the ability to share concerns that another member may be at serious risk of harming themselves or someone else. They establish multidisciplinary teams of school staff that help respond when a student's in crisis. These teams receive information about the student, assess the threat, and design an intervention program to prevent eventual violence. A 2018 Department of Homeland Security report stated, preventing violence by detecting and addressing these behavioral red flags is more effective than any physical security measure. In order for threat assessment programs to be successful, they need to have 3 key components. They need to identify students at risk to themselves or others by establishing some source of reporting resource. So this could be an anonymous tip line or social media monitoring. The caveat to that, though, is that they still need to uphold student civil rights and make sure there's not a disproportionate impact on historically marginalized students. They need to address student access to guns, and they need to invest in school-based mental health services by hiring a sufficient number of psychologists, social workers, nurses, and counselors to work in these schools. These programs are widely recommended for preventing school violence. In fact, several student studies have found schools that have used threat assessment programs see as few as 0.5 to 3.5% of these violent threats carried out, and none of them include killing, shooting, or seriously injuring someone. They also show that schools with threat assessment programs see fewer suspensions, less expulsions, and in general lead to fewer arrests. Students who commit violent acts have almost always previously shown warning signs to someone. The key is to identify these students who may be in crisis and provide behavioral and mental health support to prevent the crisis from becoming violent. To do this in a manner that serves students and protects the community, schools, in concurrent with community partners, need to create a trauma-informed crisis intervention practice that involves the convening of this multidisciplinary team that responds when students may be in crisis. State legislature also needs to make funding available for schools to invest in personnel training and mental health care resources to promote restorative justice and de-escalation practices that trauma-informed crisis intervention programs require. Based on what we know about school violence, it's critical to respond to many forms of student crisis, like substance use and housing instability, not just threats of violence. Building on recent concerns about an over-reliance on punitive response to students in crisis and the undue harm of this approach for students of color and students with disabilities, education experts are placing emphasis on intervention to prevent violence, but also on building out resources to support these students in crisis. So these students can include these resources can include mental health, housing, parental and family support, juvenile court representation, and more. There's also a greater emphasis on ongoing follow-up on the students' progress, like wrapping around with families and teachers to truly make sure that students are successful. One program that offers a step-by-step approach that emphasizes this supportive, less punitive alternative is the R model, and it was developed with the Minnesota School Safety Center. This model emphasizes the difference between disruptive and truly dangerous behavior and offers solutions that do not escalate concerning acts or punish typical adolescent behavior. Such models are essential for creating emotionally safe environments and keeping students in school and out of the criminal justice system. Any crisis intervention program has to be paired with a rigorous assessment of efficacy and collateral harms to prevent disproportionate or unwarranted interventions. Any decision that leads to a punitive action or law enforcement engagement has to be reviewed by school district leaders, as these really need to be the rare instances and an exception to a healthy threat assessment program. In addition to enacting secure storage laws, policymakers and educators need to encourage a culture of secure gun storage by increasing awareness of secure storage practices. For years, Mom Demand Action has run a program called Be Smart. This program focuses on fostering conversations with adults about gun storage to facilitate behavior change and address the hundreds of unintentional shootings committed and experienced by children every year. So the acronym SMART stands for Secure Guns in Homes and Vehicles, Model Responsible Behavior, Ask about Unsecured Guns in the Home, Recognize the Role of Guns in Suicide, and Tell Your Peers to Be Smart. Governors, federal and state departments of health, legislatures, nonprofit organizations, and local officials should also work together to develop and fund programs that increase awareness of the need to store firearms securely. Schools need to distribute this information to parents about the importance of secure storage. School officials in LA, San Diego, Houston, Denver, Nevada, and Tennessee are already doing this. And so far, school districts comprising nearly 3 million students are publishing this material and dispersing it. As part of an effective threat assessment and management strategy, and to promote successful student outcomes and overall violence reduction, schools need to ensure that students have sufficient access to professionals who can provide mental health services, including psychologists, social workers, nurses, and counselors. School-employed mental health professionals are a critical resource for students as they navigate the education system and the challenges of emotional and social development. These professionals are usually also the first to know if a student's experiencing problems and are able to intervene before it turns to violence. They can guide students through emotional and behavioral problems and serve as a key point of intervention in threat assessment programs. The National Association of School Psychologists found that the student to psychologist ratio is 1,400 students to 1 psychologist. 2 to 3 times higher than the recommended 500 to 700 students. To protect our schools and ensure that threat assessment programs are effective, legislatures need to fund and schools need to prioritize hiring an appropriate number of mental health professionals. Supportive and trusting school environments are the strongest way to prevent school violence. When communities are focused on student well-being, schools become a place of care and compassion for the challenges that kids face, while also creating the conditions for preventing school shootings and in general violence. Given the evidence that most school shooters are current or former students and that they nearly always show warning signs, the locus of school violence prevention has to center around schools. One means of creating safe schools is to support them becoming community schools, the focal point and the heart of their community. Many organizations recommend that schools use district, state, and federal funding to help partner with community members to move beyond the normal confines of a school, particularly in communities with high rates of gun violence. Schools work with local partners to provide valuable services that help uplift an entire community. They not only become centers of education, but fulfill a broader purpose of contributing to stable and healthy and safe neighborhoods. In schools facing high levels of violence in and out of their school building, a school community may fund safe passage to and from school, granting alternatives to out-of-school suspensions that still offer a meaningful educational experience, provide family counseling, increase access to mentoring, and incorporating restorative justice into their discipline policies. One example of a partnership between school and a promising community program is an initiative that offered CPT therapy for at-risk young people in schools on the west and south sides of Chicago. Participation in the program reduced violent crime by about 50% and decreased juvenile justice system readmission rates by almost 80%. Zero tolerance policies, those in earnest in attempt to make schools safe and orderly, can end up punishing students who exhibit behavior that actually needs compassionate intervention. In addition, these policies create a threatening climate that instills fear and erodes student trust, reducing the chances that students will actually come forward and provide information if they're concerned about a classmate. The zero tolerance approach has a profoundly negative effect on students of color. Schools need to review their discipline policies to make sure that they're not unduly punishing students for normal adolescent behavior, nor creating a climate that reduces the willingness of students to share concerning information, and that staff are trained on appropriate ways to manage their classroom and implicit biases. Planning and preparing are key to ensuring an effective response if an incident of gun violence does occur on school grounds. Security experts universally agree that school personnel need to have an effective emergency plan in place to respond quickly to and neutralize any threat. Many organizations recommend that school personnel, in collaboration with law enforcement, plan for the unlikely event of gun violence emergency or active shooter incident through regular practice. Recommendations for effective planning includes efforts to ensure that schools work with law enforcement and first responders to provide information about the school's layout and security measures, that staff and law enforcement work together to ensure that they can identify the nature of a threat, and that schools make a detailed plan for their lockdown and evacuation procedures. Emergency procedures must be trauma informed, meaning that they should involve a few things. A realization of the widespread prevalence and impact of trauma, a recognition of the signs of traumatic exposure, and a response grounded in evidence-based practices that resist re-traumatization of individuals. This means emergency planning should be buttressed by trigger warnings and access to mental health counseling and should never simulate an active shooter event. Trauma-informed emergency planning requires that the staff involved have tools to change emergency and evacuation planning in real time should any activities prove harmful to anyone participating. Research, though, emphasizes the importance of excluding students from these drills. Given their unique developmental stage and mounting evidence of the various harms inflicted and sustained through these drills, this is now even more apparent. If a school finds the need to implement active shooter drills with students, these are 6 recommendations to follow. Drills should not include simulations that mimic an actual incident. Feels unnecessary to say this, but we should not pull students and staff from their classrooms and shoot them in the back with pellet guns. Parents need to have advance notice of drills. Parents know their children the best. They know if they're developmentally and socially ready and or capable to not only participate in these events, but they can be your partner in helping prepare students as well as helping them debrief afterwards. Drills need to be announced to students and educators prior to the start. None of these should take any staff or students off guard. Schools should create age and developmentally appropriate drill content with the involvement of school personnel, particularly the mental health providers that are in the school. Schools should couple drills with trauma-informed approaches to address students' well-being both during the drills and over a sustained period thereafter. I just showed you a bunch of research that said that there was still concerns 90 days after a drill. And schools should track data about the efficacy and effects of drills. Comprehensive school safety plans require far more than periodic active shooter drills. In fact, it is increasingly apparent that these drills are not even an essential part of the equation, as they appear to cause unintended but serious harm to participants in the broader community. So lastly, what is your role as a psychiatrist? You are the subject matter expert. I'll let that sink in for a minute. You are the subject matter expert on trauma-informed care. So it is your obligation to be involved with your community. Even if you don't see children, you will see teachers, staff, parents, and law enforcement that are all affected not only by gun violence, but by active shooter drills. You may see an increase in stress-related responses or a resurgence in trauma symptoms leading up to and surrounding drills. Help to enforce and create community schools. Get involved in state and federal law legislation, because again, you are the subject matter experts. Why should we allow people who have never studied, don't work with patients, have no idea about the true mental health implications, make the federal laws that dictate how our community works and surrounds gun violence and active shooter drills? Counsel and educate your patients on safe gun storage, not for themselves, for their children, friends, family, and understand your local extreme risk laws and how to enact them if you're concerned. Couple resources that I pulled. The top are specifically for psychiatrists. That third one is actually a psychiatric interest group that specifically works on gun violence prevention. I think Everytown, which I reference quite a bit, does a really great job of making information digestible, and they have the research to back it up. They wrote some pretty extraordinary executive summaries to pull from. And then lastly, although it is a news article, I think they did a wonderful job of actually taking all the extreme risk laws from the DMV, so Maryland, DC, and Virginia, and putting them in one place with like nice bullet points and easy to understand and digest. And here's some other references. If you need also some more digestible material, I wrote a blog for the APA Foundation that's easily Googleable. And then Medscape put together a resource that I was involved in that had pediatricians, primary care providers, and there was an article published specifically for primary care and parents about active shooter drills and gun violence. So those are also some ways that you can get resources to your patients or yourself. So what questions can I answer for you? Yeah.
Hi, Chelsea. First, I just want to say, I think your passion for this as a parent, as is like your refinement and work you probably put in for this, and I think that's part of this here. It's a great job. I really want to commend you on that. You touched a little bit on that at the end, but throughout this, I was kind of, in my mind, I had pushed. I was thinking about that a lot, and then you say necessary evil, and thinking about those adult learners who were going through that grueling experience, very, very difficult, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, a lot of, taking any time out. And like I said, at the end, you talk about how you should remove the children from it. What do you think about kind of putting the adults, the teachers, through these kind of a little more grueling scenarios as a necessary evil?
Yeah. So my clip doesn't work anymore. I promise I didn't press the button.
No, it's okay. You can.
Here we go. So what I would, so this is, I think, the key of maybe what you're getting at is those, for our adult learners, we still need to take in consideration trauma-informed care. So knowing that our students come with many different types of trauma, right? Especially when you look at abuses, there's probably a lot of combat trauma, prior enlisted service members, and knowing what that may look like. I think we do, as probably psychiatry residents, do a great job of being able to kind of pick out those that may need specific attention and a little extra support. But knowing too that there needs to be evidence-based practices that doesn't actually continue to sustain the re-traumatization of these people. So maybe that's a valid intervention, right? Maybe we need to look at Bushmaster and make sure that we're actually, as medical providers, carrying out procedures that are trauma-informed.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions, unless I will be comments. Thank you for your great presentation.
Thank you.